Right. The acting president of the African Ombudsman and Mediators Association, AOMA, Honorable Madeleine Nirere, Ombudsman of Rwanda, our distinguished speakers, Advocate Zetu Makamandela Magukulwa, former Ombudsman, University of Cape Town, South Africa, Amanda Dean, Ombudsman for staff and faculty at Austin Community College, Natalie Sharp, Director of the Office of Student Ombuds, University of Alberta, Canada, Jean Greer, Vice President of the European Network of Ombuds in Higher Education, United Kingdom, and our facilitator, Honorable Judy Boncompagne, Protector of Rights, Rights Protection Office, Polytechnique, Montreal. Excellencies, Honorable Ombudsmen who are able to join us, distinguished participants and guests, members of the media, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the Vice Chancellor and the Council of the University of KwaZulu-Natal, as well as the Dean of the School of Law, I have great pleasure in welcoming you to this afternoon's webinar session on showcasing Sectional Ombudsman, Higher Education. Our host today is the African Ombudsman Research Centre, known as AORC, which is a research and training arm of the African Ombudsman Mediators Association, known as AOMA. When the COVID-19 pandemic broke out, AORC revised its training program by expanding its use of digital platforms. I'm happy to report that despite various post-pandemic challenges, we are continuing to deliver on our mandate to promote capacity development, knowledge generation, and professionalism within AOMA in furtherance of good governance, the rule of law, and the protection of human rights. An ombudsman is an official who is charged with representing the interests of the public by investigating and addressing complaints of maladministration or violations of human rights by members by public authorities. In general terms, an ombudsman is an official appointed to provide a check on government and governance and its activities in the interests of the citizens and to oversee the investigation of complaints of improper activity against citizens. Officials make decisions and determinations in the course of delivering services and are expected to make those decisions and determinations in a fair and non-oppressive manner to the benefit or for the benefit of members of the public. The citizenry will turn to the ombudsman when the official's decision or determinations is or seems to be unfair or oppressive. By checking allegations of maladministration and inquiring into the decision-making process, the ombudsman can determine how the decision was made and consequently make recommendations to target an improved service and, more importantly, to prevent similar occurrences in the future. Accountability and good governance are ensured only if parties draw and learn from their errors. This remains the fundamental principle behind the work of the ombudsman, for without it, there is no way that the office can make a real difference. If the goal of the ombudsman is to ensure that governance prevails and acts of maladministration are rectified, then it goes to the heart of upholding the functions of a democratic state and or a well-run institution. This afternoon's webinar will be talking to an issue that is hugely important to ensuring accountability in the manner in which higher education officials perform their functions when persons are placed at the mercy of the institution. The conversation to follow, titled Showcasing Sectoral Ombudsman, in brackets Higher Education, will discuss the legal basis and mandate of the Higher Education Ombudsman, the relationship with the National Ombudsman, the process of appointment and removal of staff, and the independence and reporting structures of the Higher Education Ombudsman. The webinar will also guide establishing a Higher Education Ombudsman office, lessons learned, and advice based on the speaker's respective experiences. I would like to thank you for your participation in these proceedings, and once again, to welcome you to this interesting discussion that will follow. Thank you very much.
Honorable Nirere. You are muted. You are muted. Okay.
Excellencies, Ombudsman here present in this webinar. Excellencies, former Ombudsman and the leadership from academia. Distinguished speakers, dear participants, ladies and gentlemen, it gives me pleasure to welcome each and every one of you in this webinar entitled Showcase Sectoral Ombudsman, Higher Education Ombudsman. I take this opportunity to commend the work of AOMA Secretariat and AORC team, who are always looking for opportunities for capacity building of ombudsman institution and their staff to increase their skills and knowledge about their mandate, responsibilities, and sharing experience. My gratitude goes also to all speakers for accepting to share from the experience and expertise in this webinar. This shows your commitment and the willingness to build strong, independent office of ombudsman and to learn from each other. Also, thank you for participants for availing yourself for this webinar this afternoon or this morning, wherever you are. This webinar is paramount to Ombudsman institution and to streamline our knowledge about the legal basis and the mandate of Higher Education Ombudsman, the relationship with the National Ombudsman, the processes of the appointment and removal of staff, the independence and reporting structures of the Higher Education Ombudsman. Distinguished participants, this webinar aims to enhance knowledge of the Higher Education Ombudsman on how he or she operates and on how the Ombudsman Office is used to protect the rights of higher education students and staff. And it is an excellent opportunity for participants to learn from experienced speakers and gain valuable insights into establishing and operating of Higher Education Ombudsman Office. Distinguished participants, I may say that many countries don't have Higher Education Ombudsman, but those who are present here and have this kind of institution can help us to know and understand more about Higher Education Ombudsman, how he or she works, and the difference between the National Ombudsman or relationship between the National Ombudsman and the Higher Education Ombudsman. The speakers will have time to share their experience. I encourage everyone to actively participate for our webinar to be the most interactive. I wish you a fruitful meeting and thank you for your kind attention. Have a great day and great meeting. And it is now my time to my great pleasure to introduce Honorable Julie Poncompen, Protector of Rights, Rights Office, Polytechnic, Montreal.
Thank
Julie,
you.
yeah, he has 20 years of experience in law, alternative dispute resolution, ADR, is an ombudsman person in higher education and accredited mediator in labor, civil, commercial law, and arbitrator. Currently, she is the protector of rights at Polytechnic in Montreal, ombudsman with the Mila, Quebec, Artificial Intelligence Institute, and the co-founder of Trust Equitable, chair of International Relations Committee of ACCUO, and president of Association of Ombudsman, University of Quebec. Julie works with individuals and through multidisciplinary teams and multi-level public and private organization to manage conflict through training, mediation, coaching, implement conflict office, etc., etc. Honorable Julie, we have a strong CV, and next time we prepare a webinar on mediation. Thank you. You have the floor. Thank you. Thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you very much, Honorable Madeleine Nyerere. This is a pleasure to be here with you. We have their participants, listeners. We have over 400 people who've registered for this webinar. So there's an interest, that's for sure. You're coming from 7 continents, over 40 different countries. I saw in the chat line, Côte d'Ivoire, Montreal, I see Toronto is in the house. And so I'm very happy to be here either in the wee or late hours of the day, or for some of us who are already in the morning of tomorrow. Welcome to this international webinar. This would not have been possible without the gathering of sister organizations that support ombudsmen in higher education. And we've heard Dr. Lindewe Makutu and Madeleine Nyerere, Ombudsman of Rwanda, acting president of AOMA, discuss about the African Association Ombudsman Research Centre. But we also have with the sister organizations, when we organize this webinar, the Association of Canadian Colleges and University Ombudspersons, ACCUO, which is dedicated to promoting and fostering ombudspersons' roles within universities, colleges across Canada. We also have with us member of the European Network of Ombudsman in Higher Education, ENOHE, better known as ENOHE, which is an association that allows ombuds to learn from each other, to help and implement good governance. That's a key word, good governance, and create a more solid base for the functioning of higher education. Finally, we have with us the International Ombuds Association, IOA, a professional association supporting organizational ombuds worldwide. The association provides mentoring and other resources and advocates for issues impacting ombuds. You're going to say, what's the common denominator between these associations? Well, they have a strong network for their members that they've developed, and they've also developed opportunities for professional development in the effort to increase the visibility, which is always an ongoing process, as we all know, to promote the role and function of ombudsmen in higher education. Some of you might not have heard, or perhaps you've heard this term. Ombudsmen in higher education are referred to as guardians of fairness, or the consciousness of their establishment. If you have read the biography of our speakers, I would have loved to introduce them, but time is also an important element. But I think they need no further presentation because they're passionate and engaged in what they do in their role as ombudsmen. I just might share one couple of things with you. As we prepared for today, I asked them a question, how they perceive the role of an ombudsman in higher education. And you won't find this in their bios, this information. But I loved how Amanda Dean said, the ombuds role is like the grass after heavy rain. It's growth after storm. Then Jean Greer, who you're going to hear, also said she sees an image of the seesaw with a small child, the youth, at one end, and on the other hand, the elephant on the other. For her, it sums up the role in many ways, how the individuals against the institution and their role in correcting sometimes the imbalances of power. I asked Natalie Sharp, and she said, well, I can only think of Leonard Cohen, one of our great songwriters, who sums it best in one of his songs. Ring the bells that still can ring. Forget your perfect offering. There's a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. So for her, it shows how cracks and gaps reveal sometimes lights that offer us a new perspective, hope, resilience to move ahead. Zetu Makamandela Ngukulua liked the information or the image of the baobab tree. Now that resonated for me. She said her visitors approach in a sage consult of gift of time being listened to. They seen and heard without losing their urgency. So for her, the baobab tree is like a resource. It's where, just like the ombuds bring a resource, it's like a succulent, and you have a vast trunk that helps to produce nutrients in the dry season when all around is dry. I love the analogy. It also creates a good shade for the weary, like we do as ombuds. For these reasons, it becomes a tree of life. Some of the participants have asked us in the questions, why have an ombuds office? I think that these images and words from our speakers is a good introduction as to how ombudsmen in higher education can help establishments in good governance. I hope this resonates for you. I won't go further out. We're going to start the questions and get on to it. I just want to know that we're going to let you shed some light on how different ombudsmen in different sectors, different continents work, different models and practices in higher education. So what further, I'm going to start with the first questions, and I'm going to ask how briefly explain to our members, our speakers, and I'm going to call them by their first name. So it's out of respect, but we all agree we could be called by our first name. So I'm Julie. We have Natalie, Amanda, Jean, and Zetu. So briefly explain your organization structure. I'd like to send that first question to Natalie and have your thoughts on that. How do you explain your organization structure? Number of members, types of ombuds offices you serve, and so on.
Okay, thank you. So our organization, ACCUO, has existed formally since 1983, and we have over 70 ombuds in about 40 higher education institutions across Canada. Higher education is decentralized, so that means no national legislation and mandating a higher education ombuds. So you can imagine that universities have evolved, ombuds have evolved in a myriad of ways. And Carolyn Staber at Chicago University used to use the term Heinz 57 to indicate the many hybrid models that are created with institutions. But most of the common characteristics that were noted by Larry Hill and around the confidentiality, independence, impartiality, and accessibility. The first ombuds was in 1965 at Simon Fraser University. So that is like the first in North America. But along with the provincial organizations that started to have the ombuds concept in Canada in the 70s, we also started to see the appearance of more higher education ombuds throughout Canada. And of course, what was happening at that time were there was a huge student democracy movement, civil rights, anti-war, feminists, Indigenous rights, gay rights, disability rights, Black rights. It was just an amazing time. I was a student then. I was, and so that's kind of what we have, and we've created mainly one-to-person, quite solitary offices, unfortunately, over the next decade.
Thank you, Natalie. I think IOA could maybe Amanda from IOA could bounce off this with the introduction of Natalie.
Absolutely. Good morning, good afternoon, good day, everyone. The IOA, the International Ombuds Association, serves over 1,100 members globally in more than 57 countries. We serve a variety of sectors though 549, the largest sector of IOA members, are in higher education. And IOA, similar to what Natalie was saying, IOA supports organizational ombuds. So ombuds that are serving in a confidential, independent, impartial, neutral, and informal role. So unlike some of the governmental ombuds or the ombudsmen that many of you know, we serve more in a informal space, making recommendations, often to leadership, but we don't do formal investigations or make formal recommendations. Most organizational ombuds are not mandated through policy. They come naturally through, as Natalie mentioned, sort of movement, right? The first ombuds offices here in the US in higher education. In Michigan also came from protest movement, from student movements, from students pushing for ombuds offices. So similar growth out of that. And then IOA came from a merge of multiple professional associations, both in higher ed and other sectors, coming together to try to expand the umbrella and offer an association for all ombuds serving around the world. So.
Well, that's interesting. So student movements, we see maybe civil rights movements are, instigators in maybe developing or implementing ombuds office. To tell me from your perspective, because I understand that this is relatively new ombudsman in higher education in Africa. I'd love to have your perspective on this.
Well, again, hi, everybody. As I sit here, I'm wearing two hats. One is that of being the IOA Africa Region Chairperson, and I'm also representing the institutions of higher education in terms of how ombudsing has evolved on the continent, and in particular in South Africa, where I'm based. So if I were to speak specifically for South Africa, we are latecomers in terms of the ombudsing discipline. There are 26 universities on the continent, well, not on the continent, in South Africa. And of the 26, only 8 have ombuds offices. In fact, where the ombuds role is, played out fully as it should be. And then you get other offices who could either be legal or offices in waiting, I usually call them, because these are the people that I invited the IOA to come out and assist with back in 2015, where the faculty came down to train people here, and people got trained. And for several reasons, and I mean, these could be budgets, these could be urgency, or sometimes relevance, or sometimes getting it. Not many of the trained people actually got up to have their universities open ombuds offices. Then in terms of where it's placed, unlike what Natalie shared with us here, universities do have autonomy, but they are also governed by an act, the Higher Education Act. And in terms of legislation, there isn't a law that says all universities ought to have ombuds offices. But I must tell you, the buy-in is there, because back in 2015, I think it was, which is what led to the training happening. The minister wrote to universities, all of them, saying they should have these offices. So I don't know what universities do not listen to the minister, but some here don't. Maybe they need a bit of whipping to say move, move, move. And I mean, I am speaking currently to 3 universities at least, so the 8 might soon be 11 before we know it.
Sometimes the stars have to align for the Ombuds office to be implemented and take space. But Jean, I'd love to hear you on this from ENOHE, some of your perspective on this as well. Thank you, Zetu.
Okay, thank you. And hello, everyone. Great to be here. So ENOHE, the European Network of Ombuds in Higher Education, celebrates its 20th anniversary this year, actually at our conference in Prague in the Czech Republic next month. Registrations are open for that. And, always glad to see some new faces there as well as old friends. ENOHE was started as an informal network, surprise, surprise, 20 years ago, given that this is our 20th anniversary. But became an association formally registered in Austria just in 2019. We've got members from over 40 countries, primarily in Europe, as our title suggests, but also in the US, Canada, Mexico, Israel, Georgia, Australasia. And working over such a diverse area, there's no standard practice. In some countries, there's a requirement, or at least an expectation, that higher education institution will have an ombudsperson. In some countries, there's an ombuds function only at national level. And in many countries, there are, in practice, campus ombuds with a national ombud as a higher authority to which a student can appeal if things are not handled well at local level. In the UK, where I'm from, I can't call myself an ombud. The title ombudsman is a protected government title just for certain government roles. But informally, and talking within the sort of ENOHE circles, I would describe my role prior to retirement as campus ombud. That is essentially what I was doing to all intents and purposes. But in short, across the ENOHE family, there's no such thing as typical or standard or classic practice in our sector. And that, I think, is one of the things that makes exchanges like this so very valuable and interesting and exciting. So thank you.
Thank you, Jean. I like the word you said, campus ombuds. Tell me, what is the most commonly used? I think maybe this is a question I can redirect to some of the speakers, because campus ombuds, I'm a protector of rights in my university. So maybe what is some of the common use of terms in your spaces? Zetu, would you like to give us a hint or some information on that?
What's common out here is ombudsman. And because a lot of the offices, subscribe to the approach of the IOA, so the IOA recently scrapped ombudsman to ombuds. So ombuds is more familiar. Some spaces use ombudsperson because they want to be sure about gender neutrality.
And yourself, Natalie, in Quebec, Canada.
It varies. So we've moved away from the ombudsman term, sometimes to ombudsperson, but now more shortened to ombuds in many areas of Canada, except in Quebec, where, as you know, Julie, you're a protector of rights, and also the ombudsman term is still used. And then we find in Newfoundland and Labrador the term citizens representative. Newfoundland, Ontario, and BC ombuds have jurisdiction over higher ed ombuds, and so many of the ombuds are in the urban centers in higher education, not in the rural, more marginalized areas where we should have more ombuds, because we need them for marginalized students such as Indigenous students. The terms that we use for students or clients, our clients and visitors, we don't use the term visitor as much, because that's an old term that was used for the lieutenant governor when their role in universities were kind of like an ombuds before the ombuds came.
Oh. Amanda, would you like to talk about maybe what it means for you, the people you're serving in your community?
Yeah, I will. I also want to say the IOA's move to not be the International Ombudsman Association and to change that language to ombuds is part because of what Jean said, that the ombudsman term is often protected in specific countries and has a meaning, a very dedicated meaning, and organizational ombuds, as I say, practice in a different way. And so to be able to allow all members to call themselves ombuds, that minor shift in language. Also, for English-speaking countries, that ombudsmen can often be interpreted as gendered, even though we know historically that is not necessarily true. And yes, in my practice, I say visitors, right? People who come in are visitors. I know some people will call them clients, or I refer to everyone in the university as constituents, right? They are my constituents, as well as colleagues, but yes, the people who come in are often called visitors.
Clients has maybe a corporate resonance for me. Jean, maybe you wanted to explain how do you call the people you serve in your work?
Yes, it's very simple for me. I simply refer them to them as complainants or complainers. In my practice, I was dealing with students, obviously. Well, not necessarily obviously, actually. I'm going to qualify that because we've got some members in ENOHE who deal only with faculty members. And we've got some ENOHE members who deal only with students. And then there are people like me who would be dealing with a wider field than that. So again, no one single standard practice on this. But I was certainly dealing with students. I was dealing with former students. I was dealing with their parents. I was dealing with applicants for admission and with members of the public. So it's complainants was the one word that would, if you like, capture them all. Interested in what Amanda was saying about constituents, because what we talk about in the UK certainly is the university community, and the university community encompasses all the students, all the faculty, the academic faculty, but also all the staff who might be librarians or grounds workers or cleaners or whatever. So we're all part of the community, and within that anybody can complain about anything, and they do.
And the community becomes larger also, I find, but there are perimeters that are set depending on each office's, their charter. This brings us to the next question, which is more related to, now that we know and understand the mandate, the legal basis of an ombudsman in higher education, there's different corporate models of ombudsman, either coming from a legislative or non-legislative statute. I also understand that, you know, I guess our participants would like to know, well, what's a regular day for an ombudsman in higher education? What does it look like? So who would like to go with this one? Nali, Zetu?
Well, there's no typical day. I mean, that would be my first response, that, you know, you walk in not knowing what the day is going to look like. But one thing for sure, there's going to be a visitor, which this is the term I use out here. There will be a visitor, and that person will have a complaint or a concern. And that person will be drawn from what Jean describes as a community. So we call them here stakeholders, or just like Amanda, constituents. So because our offices are a zero barrier office, anyone is welcome. And I'm yet, in my professional life, I'm yet to see an office that functions like that. I mean, I've been thinking about this, and I find it being our way of working in our offices, where 1 minute you sit with an executive, the next minute you sit with a janitor, and you deal with them just the same way because they are your visitors. So there's no typical day. People bring issues, people come, never to talk about what's working. It's always, you know, a point of discomfort. And, you know, when we write reports, which is unfortunate, we know that the establishments we service, they do have a lot good that's going on, but our role is not to actually highlight the good, because there are other areas or spaces to do that, but ours is to shine light in what Natalie called the cracks. So we basically help them see, you know, their shadow, almost like in a way of holding a mirror to say, this is what I'm seeing. Fix what needs fixing, and it's just my recommendation. So we have this situation.
Sorry, Zetu. So redressing the situation. This aligns with what Nali was saying. Nali, would you like to comment with this?
Okay. So we've been around for over 50 years at our institution, and I would say that our model has evolved, where we did first start with a retired professor, faculty member, and it evolved where it was run by students. Even as in a gap, there was a student news editor who took over, and then it ran as a joint student and university, and now it's purely a university operation. And the way it is today is that we have an internship program in its 9th year, so we've got quite a complex and unique unit in that we have specialized. With me as the director, we have a graduate ombudsperson, undergraduate ombudsperson, and 3 paid ombuds interns who are trained and mentored by us. So it gives us a lot of flexibility in terms of working with students. And we do have a large caseload. We're known at the university. We have almost 1,500 cases per year. Students can visit us at any stage of the conflict. So we're not an office of last resort. We're able to, in addition to working one-on-one with students, and you can imagine the graduate ombuds works mainly with graduate students on supervisory conflicts. The undergraduate can be a myriad of problems related to academic integrity issues. But we also run many workshops in addition to the one-on-one coaching. And these are on fairness, implicit bias, knowing your rights, managing supervisory conflicts, etc. When we work with students, it's more of a coaching to help them find their agency so that they can speak their narrative and transform their lives. We want them to exercise their rights. And so we're highly visible within our institution. We are hoping to add a faculty ombuds back again into our fold, as we now have moved on to a new reporting relationship, and we're moving over now to report to the Vice Provost of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. So lots of change has been going on in the 50 years that we've been on our campus.
Thank you, Natalie. Zetu, I know I cut you off a little bit, but I want to hear you out on the terms of reference that clarifies the mandate that you have right now in your daily work. So maybe you want to provide us some information on that.
Well, again, going back to the body that guides how we do the work, the IOA, we use confidentiality, impartiality, and independence. And much as, and Amanda spoke about informality, which is part of, what the IOA prescribes as one of the standards. But what we've picked up, and it's not just Africa, it's, here on Africa and Asia Pacific, is that the term informal can mean different things to different people. So we've tweaked it ever so slightly to say, instead, we work outside of formal structures, because informal could mean, so what's the point? If I'm coming to you and you're informal, am I not wasting my time? I'm troubled already as it is. So we use working outside of formal structures to show that in terms of reporting, we report outside of the university typical organogram. Reporting line is to the highest body of governance, which is the council of the university. And that also speaks to independence, because it means people feel freer or, more enabled to bring their issues, knowing that they will be treated with confidentiality and that we are not part of the establishment, so to speak. We are there to service the institution. I usually say, I used to say, I'm an insider that's outside, whatever that means.
Well, that's not, it's actually, we're inside, but external. Yeah. And we do have this impact with the different members of the communities in creating this security space where there's no retaliation or reprisals, but if there's situations to redress, that we can examine that and listen to them. Thank you, Zetu. I appreciate this. Tell me, I'm going to have to jump to other questions because time is running. But Jean, I'd like to know from you, what are some of the cases you deal with, the nature of the cases more specifically? I think your mic is mute.
Sorry, just finding the right button there. I suppose if I talk from the UK point of view, we have what I refer to as the ABC of essential policies within our institutions here. A stands for academic appeals, B stands for student behaviour, though more usually we refer to that as conduct, but that doesn't fit the alphabet ABC so well, so I talk about behaviour, and C equals complaints. So those three policies, academic appeals, student behaviour, student conduct, and complaints are really the three underpinning policies that an ombud is likely to be working with in the UK. In some institutions, the ombuds will deal with all three. In others, only some of those issues. And handling complaints, I would say, is the very minimum that the ombud deals with. In my previous role, as I say, I handled complaints from students, their parents, from members of the public, and so on. And as we've already touched on, there's no such thing as a typical day. You never know what's going to come through the door or through the email, as Zetu has said. Never a dull moment, never a typical day. In terms of types of cases, I think it very broadly, I could split those into things like academic. So an academic complaint might be something like a student falling out with their PhD supervisor, not getting a place on the optional courses they wanted, or complaining about teaching methods or library resources, something like that, if you like, classic academic complaint territory. Also see quite a lot of systemic complaints. So frustration over processes like registering for exams, you know, a system's down or it's clunky or something doesn't link with something, or you appear to be going round in circles and not getting registered and it's just taking too long. So systemic things like that. Receiving payment of expenses for a study trip, that's the sort of thing that would quite often, something would fall down a crack somewhere and lead to a complaint. And then the other big area, I would say, is what I loosely class as interpersonal, and that could cover anything from a minor disagreement with housemates or classmates to an allegation of bullying by a faculty member. And of course, awareness of gender-based violence has come to the fore increasingly in recent years, and that's the source of many complaints. ENOHE's actually doing a webinar on gender-based violence later this week, and registration for that's still open too. So that is really covering the interpersonal. So and I suppose a big variety there. And again, one of the reasons that I've always found the job so interesting, you never know what you're going to be up against from one day to the next. It's always going to be slightly different and always going to be challenging in different ways.
It's absolutely true. From the moment, you know, there's admission, new students, to the time of graduations, whether you're undergraduate, graduate, but, you know, is it the same thing for an ombudsman and for faculty members, Amanda? Just curious.
Yeah, so I serve in an office that is specifically for faculty and staff. So all educational faculty, hourly staff, like as Zetu said, the administrators and the janitors, anyone can come. And I do have students that find me, obviously, because, you know, students are resourceful. And I don't turn people away, I can help people. But from my personal perspective, right, more of my visitors, more of my cases are that interpersonal interaction. So they're sort of classical workplace issues, right? I have a problem with my supervisor, you know, even from the way that they speak to me to the way they're communicated to not understanding policy. I do have a lot of policy clarifications. And as we serve in that outside of the formal structure role, I also have folks who come to me with questions about formal structure. So I want to file a grievance, or I'm thinking about filing a grievance. Can you help me understand that process? What does the formal process look like? An opportunity to sort of prep them or talk to them about what it looks like. What are their goals? Help them articulate those things that they're looking for within the formal process without participating in it. So I do some of that coaching, but a lot of it, the vast majority is that interpersonal workplace dynamic. It is a colleague problem, a supervisor problem, a second level supervisor issue, right? I work at a community college in Austin, Texas. We're very geographically large. We have over 13 campuses. And so there are often things about geography too, physical geography, where people moving departments, sort of all of those minutia of work that you just get, but within the context of a college setting, right? A higher educational setting. It's still a job, still a workplace. So people have all the same issues they would in another workplace setting, right? And so it's a little different. It's a little less of the grade and academic side. Though faculty here also have the same faculty issues, right? We don't have tenure as some of the big universities. Our faculty members are on a contract, but they're still the same things. Adjuncts who come and say, I wasn't given the classes I was expecting to get, or that person doesn't have as much experience as I do, but they're being given that class when I should be getting priority. How do, all of the myriad of things that can come up for people in a day.
So their participants, you can see it can be very variable in the type of nature of cases that can be handled by these ombudsmen in higher education, whether they're working with faculty or they're working with the whole community, that is students as well as professors and faculty and personnel. So it will vary depending on each establishment. Now let's get into our second part of our webinar, which a lot of the participants, their speakers are asking, what's an effective ombuds office? What do you need to establish a university or college ombuds office? What are the key ingredients? I know, Natalie, we had discussed and you had mentioned you had some words to say, share with us. I'd love to hear you on it.
Okay, so it's really good to go back to Larry Hill, because he really outlines this carefully in terms of the being legally established or having a very strong terms of reference. And the independence is really critical. External to administration, if you can, even. And the specialist of the ombuds, their expertise, making sure that you're nonpartisan and normatively universalistic. Being client-centered, but that doesn't mean that you're totally anti-administration. You're just focused on your client. And you're popularly accessible and visible. You are known. You are a person. You are the human face of the university. We are guided, of course, by our ACCUO standards of practice, which are independence, confidentiality, impartiality, and accessible. So when clients know this, they can trust that the ombuds will serve them well, and that our office is credible and operates with integrity. So we need space, obviously, that's accessible. We need it private, in a private space. We need the resources and staffing to operate effectively. But these are the chronic problems with universities, that we're underfunded in our office and often isolated and alone and not known.
Thank you. Nadia, just question, more normatively universalistic. What does that mean?
So it's applying the principles of fairness, which I'll get into later, but really ensuring that we're not focused on just serving a special group, where we're really looking at fairness and in our institution. And it ties in with the equity, diversity, and inclusiveness that's going on as a major strategy at universities these days.
Okay, I know I asked a big question there. We're going to get to it later. But Jean, tell me, from your perspective, thank you, Natalie. From your perspective, what do you need to establish a university or college ombudsman office?
Okay, yes, thank you. Thinking about this sort of off the top of my head just quickly, I've gone for bullet points on this and really got 7 points. The very first one of those is buy-in from senior management. If you haven't got senior management agreeing that the institution needs an ombuds office, you might as well go home now. No, I wouldn't go home now. What I would do is I would argue my corner very, very forcibly on that one, and and hope to change hearts and minds on that. But yes, that buy-in from senior management is the number one essential, I would say. You need time and space to design good policies on appeals, student conduct and complaints, the sort of ABC that I was talking about, if those are not already in place. And that's a lot of the work I'm now doing with institutions, is working on or reviewing and revising those sorts of policies. Definitely an access all areas approach. I think we've all of us touched on the broad scope that complaints can cover. And yes, to be talking to a cleaner one day and a technician the next day and a professor of aeronautics the day after that, that is the sort of access all areas approach that we need to have. I think there's also a lot about personal confidence there, and that's the confidence to train colleagues across the institution. I'm very much in favour of early resolution of complaints, and that is what I spent a great deal of my time doing, was skilling people up to deal with things at local level, so that hopefully that little complaint was never going to land on my desk because it had already been handled very competently and very well at local level. So putting out I often use the analogy of firefighting on this one, putting out blowing out the birthday cake candle before it becomes a towering inferno. So getting people trained to have the confidence to deal with small complaints at local level. And then also in there is something about good liaison and trust building with student representative bodies. If we can get our student representative bodies, assuming we've got them, if we can get them accepting that we're there to help, that is all really important stuff. We've touched on as well, I think already, an open door approach. So I always wanted to be able to staff to be able to feel that they could ask my advice. I often used a saying that my grandmother had, which was that there's no such thing as a silly question. There can be a silly answer, but there's no such thing as a silly question. And so very much encouraging people to come to me and ask what might seem like the daft question, but if they don't know the answer, then it's not daft. It's not a daft question. And if I can take 5 minutes to help find a way through something, that's what I will do. So very much that open door approach where staff can ask advice in confidence at any time. So open door, but also, and again, this has been mentioned too, private office. I ideally would be detached from any departmental allegiance, if you like, a department all on my lonesome. And that's really, I think, important to demonstrate your impartiality, your objectivity to anyone who comes to you, whether they're complaining or whether they're being complained about, whether they're needing advice about blowing out the birthday cake candle at low level, or whether they're dealing with something bigger than that. So those are my quick bullet points on this.
I think they're very useful, what Natalie has explained, as well as Jean, for even if you have an ombuds office and you're encountering certain difficulties, develop allyship with your senior management, or having a private ombuds office that's not right in front of the registrars or directors office, because otherwise members will not come to your office. They won't want to see people coming in and out. So confidentiality is something, even in the physical spaces as well, virtual spaces. This leads us to our next question, which I think it will shape a bit the color of how our leadership, our speakers work in the role of and function of ombudsman. I'm wondering, how is an ombudsman determined and or influenced by the culture of its organization? And we had started discussing that with Zetu. Maybe I'll let you take the lead on that one.
Well, my answer is yes, because much as there is a guideline of how work ought to be done, there's a phrase that we use as ombuds, at least within the IOA, that you must ombuds where you are. So you have to be relevant. So one of the things that are important is to understanding the backstory. I think because I was the inaugural ombud at the University of Cape Town, I needed to find out, where does this idea come from? Why do you need an office like this? I think that becomes important because from that kind of emergence, the thought, you then look at what is it that is at stake? Where are my services most required? And again, here in South Africa, we come from, an apartheid era where issues of diversity, like Natalie mentioned, diversity, equality, equity, and belonging are still an issue, especially in establishment, like where I used to work, the University of Cape Town, with a history that is, white and colonial. So there's a lot of work, or in fact, problems would come from people feeling like they are not treated fairly, they are not seen, there's no dignity, there's discrimination. And sometimes that discrimination, once you get to engage the person, you will realize that, let's say it's the policy issue. The answer is correct because we are not advocates for our visitors, nor are we advocates for the appointing institution. My experience was that sometimes what the student perhaps is told is actually correct, but how the message was imparted is problematic. So then it makes it interpersonal. It could be an academic issue, but you find that in the academic project, there are interpersonal motivations that actually make their way in, and then we come in, because one of the issues is whether or not we should, as ombuds, deal with academic issues. And I keep explaining that it's not the content of what is taught, but it's how the teaching enterprise is basically done and the feedback that comes with it, the policies, their application. So ours is to basically, based on what people come to complain about, put those policies to a test. Reviewing them, like Jean said, sometimes helping with a review or identifying gaps. For example, at the University of Cape Town, one of my latest contributions towards the end of my time was they are having to put together a bullying policy, which was a policy that was never there before. And it was my office that actually said, you have a gap in your operations.
Good. That resonates, I think, with some of the analogies we made where we're, when you have a heavy storm or rainy day, Amanda said, the ombuds grows, it sets the seeds to promote fairness within the establishment or to, respond to something where there's no policies put in place, like bullying policies, intimacy. This is interesting. Natalie, from you spoke earlier about the fairness lenses. Maybe this would come and tie into the cultural, organizational structure of the Ombuds Office. What's your perspective on that?
So in Canada, we use the lens, which is kind of a tool, a triangle, and it's borrowed from an Australian model that was then adapted by provincial ombuds and then readapted. And I think it was Martine Conway, when she was at U of Victoria, first used it. Now Nora Farrell continued with a checklist as well. So what this triangle is it focuses on, at one end, the procedural fairness of how policies and decisions are made. So the procedural is how the decision is made. Relational fairness is about how the person was treated. So that's on another point. And then on the final point, the substantive fairness, was the decision itself fair? So ombuds have used fairness checklists as well to determine whether or not there were procedural administrative issues around fairness in various policies, procedures, even in administrative tribunal appeal hearings. And of course, the term often used for those two kinds is due process. We also note the fairness lens extended to whether the student was treated with dignity and respect. And a final one, was there equitable fairness? In other words, was there social location taken into consideration to remove barriers and level the playing field when making decisions? So when we examine casework, we use triangle to engage in an in-depth analysis of fairness. We can use it with our visitors. We can also use it in explaining decisions around fairness to university administrators and faculty. So it's a very valuable tool that we have in our kit to deal with these kinds of issues at universities.
Thank you, Natalie. I'm just going to, speakers, I'm going to add a question because I'm seeing a lot of questions of our participants that are asking questions about recommendations and how we implement these recommendations. Maybe quickly, I'll give a minute to each one of you. Just give me how does it work within your organization, and how do you work when you meet resistance, people who do not want to implement the recommendations? So I'll just give about a minute. I'm sliding this in because I'm seeing a lot of our participants asking the question. Who wants to jump in? Go ahead, Zeti.
I'll be quick, Julie, on this one, because by the time we get to reporting and making recommendations, at least in writing, there's been many recommendations made as you deal with issues throughout the time before the reporting time. So you recommend, it happens, and then the main recommendations, at least from how I practice, the main recommendations that would lead to being recorded in a report form are the ones that cut across, where you know that the appointing institution, if they were to pick this up as a gap, everybody would benefit. And by the time it gets there, nothing is new, things are known. Hence, it is important that before things are out, everybody says what's in the document if you produce a report. And then if there are questions, concerns, things are cleared out before issues become out in the public domain. Then, in terms of taking them quickly, in terms of taking them, whether or not they're accepted, it all depends on the relationship, where there's a relationship and readiness. If the institution is ripe for the service and the ombudsman is trusted, like Jean said, if that relationship is the one of trust and there's buy-in, there usually isn't a problem with recommendations.
Natalie, would you like to bounce off of what Zetu said?
So we make annual recommendations in our report, and yes, sometimes they're not followed, but guess what? They reappear in the next year, and maybe somebody's ready for it the next year round, or they're thinking about it and they want to consult more, and it might be the right time later. But we also do a lot of other work in terms of informal kinds of consultations, so that what I would call kind of mini recommendations are there when we're working one-on-one, perhaps when a faculty member calls or administrator calls and they're concerned about something. We also play a non-voting role on some committees that are formulating policies around academic work, and they often want to hear the Ombuds lens on fairness. So that's very helpful as well.
Amanda, I saw your finger, you're lifting your hand up. Go ahead.
Well, I think it actually fits into the question of culture also, right? So the way that our recommendations are taken fits with how our institutions are working. Before I was here, I worked at a big, well-known four-year college that was very entrenched in its, in the way that it worked. And so it was very different the way that they received recommendations and were able to implement recommendations. I feel like I also report annually. I present to our cabinet my recommendations, and I will say for my first 2 years, they were exactly the same, though with more detail the second year, right? We don't have the authority to force people into accepting the recommendations. It's more of a soft power, right? It's that working with people, building the trust, so that when I say things like, we should take emotional intelligence into our hiring criteria, right? We're lacking some emotional intelligence with leadership. What do we do? And so then being able to have those mini conversations ahead of time about how does hiring work and how are we training hiring committees and what are we doing here, so that when it's a big recommendation, it's not a surprise and it's, the train's already moving in some ways, right? I think that one of the superpowers of ombuds is asking good questions. And so sometimes we're not making a recommendation. We're just saying, what is this thing? What do you see when you look at this? And people go, oh, maybe we should talk about that. And then suddenly I get an email that says, we've rewritten this policy. And it's like, oh, good job, everybody, right? So sometimes it's that soft power, and sometimes it's big formal recommendation type
But
things.
it takes skill to take or make a recommendation. It takes allyship. You need to inform your stakeholders ahead of time so they know what's coming up in the annual report. Jean, give you the last minute on this one.
Okay, thank you. Yes, one of the things that, well, I suppose we need to separate out the little recommendation that will affect this one student from the big recommendation that might require a whole system change. And one of the things that I will not do is allow there to be a recommendation that is not deliverable. So, and an example I use when I'm doing training is that somebody investigating a complaint might say, oh, well, it's quite simple, isn't it? Our student record system is just not fit for purpose. I'm making a recommendation that we get a brand new student record system into the institution by the end of this month. That will solve everything. And you're all laughing. We all know it's going to take us 2-3 years at least to get a new student record system in place. So there is no point in making that recommendation, even if we know that the current student record system is not fit for purpose. There is no point making that recommendation. What we can do is make some recommendations about needing to look at this bit of it or that bit of it, and really needing to make sure that committee time is given to discussing how that can be improved within a 5-year time frame or whatever it might be. So making sure that recommendations are deliverable so that we're not then in turn putting our institutions into a difficult position of not being able to deliver. But if you've got an institution that's simply choosing to ignore you completely, I think that's got to come back to the hearts and minds stuff. And I really like Amanda's sort of subtle backdoor approach, if you like, of tackling that. So worth a try, always worth a try.
I think this is really generating a lot of questions with our participants. So we might go to another question, which is going to be related to reporting. They're asking questions about, is it public or not? But before we get to that, do you investigate in your office? I wondered if, so we have different reactions here. So Amanda, you shaked your hand. So do you have a power investigation in your office? And if you do, is it systemic or individual? So how do you make the recommendations if you can't investigate?
So in that sense of informality, I do keep track of trends. So I look at a few demographic data points. When visitors come to me, I ask how long they've been with the institution and what their job classification is. So not what their job title is, but are they, an hourly non-exempt? So in the US, you can either get overtime or not get overtime. So which one of those are they, right? So the classification of their job. And then I look at those trends, the themes of topics that come up. And I work in a notebook. Everything's handwritten because documents get shredded, right? Working for a public institution in the US, everything is a public record. If you make an official document, anyone can see it. So for confidentiality, I make no official documents until I write an annual report. But the recommendations that I come from the trends that I see. So one of the metaphors I often use is, if I think of the college or the institution as a big ship, a boat, right? And there's the radar showing what we see. And I did not make this up myself. The ombuds is putting the dots on the radar, right? We're sort of trying to see what's out there. And so the more people I hear from, the more I am able to paint that picture and see what's going on at the college that is that informal. We do a lot of surveying of our staff and faculty and students around their job experience, around things that are happening at the college. We have an entire office of institutional research here. And so what I'm looking for is more of the informal stuff. What is coming up for people individually and not on sort of the big level. And so the recommendations come from the experience of visitors. Now, I will get permission from individual visitors to maybe go find out what's happening, right? So if someone comes to me and says, I feel like what's happening in my department is unfair, or, this is the story, I might say, are you comfortable with me reaching out to X person and finding out, right? So almost shuttle diplomacy in a way, right? Going back and forth between people, but it's not a formal investigation, right? We might say it's a little I investigation as opposed to a big I investigation. But sometimes I do ask questions, right? It's that, hey, do you see this thing, right? Asking questions of supervisors, of second level supervisors, right? Again, I work in a big geographic institution. And so sometimes we have regionalization things or reporting lines. So going and saying, hey, why was this department reorganized, right? Or can you tell me the thought process behind moving these pieces around, right? And so sometimes for people, it's just helping them to understand reasoning. And so if I can get the answer of why a decision was made, then it helps them to to move forward and have buy-in with it. But again, yes, it's not formal investigation, right? We have formalized offices that do formal investigations, but there is asking questions, finding information.
You see, there are participants. I thought that all ombudsmen did investigations, but maybe Natalie, you can bounce off of what Amanda said.
Yeah. So in Canada, many university offices do have that power. Ours does not have that power. But what we engage in, what we can engage in is a kind of similar consultation process, and we use the term administrative inquiries. So these can be requested by students, faculty, or administration. And typically it's regarding a policy or decision, whether it was fair. And then they want us to just review it, make recommendations to the policy. And so what we can look for are things that might unintentionally present barriers to marginalized groups within the institution, and try to promote more flexible kinds of policies to maintain standards, but allow for alternative kinds of options to level the playing field. So it could be, alternative formats to exams or access to an interpreter at a formal hearing. Those could be two examples.
Thank you, Natalie. Thank you. Jean, did you want to say something regarding this particular investigation? Do you have a couple bullet points to share with us?
Yeah, well, I've already mentioned the wide range of practice among ENOHE members, given the range of countries that from which we come. So you won't be surprised to hear that members' powers vary enormously as well. And that's something that we've had really interesting and lively debate on when we've been discussing we're just producing a document called Values and Principles. So there's been a lot of discussion around that. Some of us adjudicate, some of us mediate. In my own institution, there was a lot of what I call mediation with a small m. So it wasn't technically mediation. It's a bit like Amanda's investigation with a small I. But some mediation type outcomes that are being looked at. Some investigation, I was certainly investigating, some decision making, and some of us can make recommendations or award financial compensation. So a whole range of things that our members might be doing in their different institutions. My personal approach, in addition to rectifying things for the individual as necessary, I think our real value lies in being able to help an institution to learn from complaints. So how can we turn this apparent negative into a positive and prevent a similar problem arising in future? And I think for me, that's often the really positive outcome from a complaint is not just that we fix things for this one little student, but that we have improved the system in some way for all the big cohort of students coming thereafter. So that I think is whether we go through that by a process of mediation, investigation, adjudication, whatever, I think that's a good outcome.
It's interesting, Jean, because I find that often when we work with academic administrators or rectors or a student, and we shed the light on something that is going or that needs to be redressed, they're actually happy that we shed the light on something that needs to be improved or worked on, or they see it with the case that's brought before them. Listen, we're getting to the last half of our period of questions. We're going to try, because time is an issue. I know our participants have a lot of questions, but let's talk about what some of the biggest challenges an ombuds in higher education can face. Jean, you started off talking about some of them in terms of leadership, having higher management allyship. But what happens? What are some of the other challenges you've seen in your experience?
Okay, thanks, Julie. I think the two biggest challenges facing us in our roles are one, inadequate resources for the job. I know that anyone in any department in any university could probably complain about inadequate resources, but I do think on the ombuds function we're particularly suffering. And the second one is mental health issues. So resources, first of all, I'm doing a lot of work with institutions since I theoretically retired a couple of years ago. And I've been called in by quite a number of institutions to help them sort out cases which have been, quite frankly, hanging around too long. And they know they've been hanging around too long. And yes, part of that's pandemic and all the knock-on effects from that. But at the bottom of it is just an under-resourcing very often of the ombuds function in universities. They've just not had the time and space and person power to deal with these issues. But the second point I was making was mental health. And the mental health of the complainant is one thing. And if I were to go through a catalogue of my most difficult cases ever, there would be a mental health issue at the root of all of those, I have to say. But we often also fail to realise the impact of mental health on our colleagues. And this is something that's really upsetting me at the moment. I am seeing excellent colleagues in a number of institutions who, quite frankly, have been burnt out by overwork, by huge caseloads of really difficult, really unpleasant cases. We're talking about people who are dealing with allegations of criminal behavior, sexual violence, etc., student on student or whatever, and dealing with cases of that type without any personal support or any sort of institutional network to give that support really has a bigger impact sometimes on staff members, and that's just not, I think, recognised as well as it should be. So I think we do need to be supporting our colleagues as well as obviously doing the job in hand, but supporting our colleagues in dealing with their own mental health as well as the mental health of their clients, their constituency, their community, whatever we want to call it. And that's one of the reasons that I find an organisation like ENOHE so valuable, is that you can talk to anyone at an ENOHE conference and know that you're talking, first of all, in a safe space, but secondly, to somebody who understands where you're coming from, even if where you're coming from is the other side of the world, in a different jurisdiction, in a different organisational structure, and so on. We all know, as we do today, the sort of issues that we're facing in our institutions.
Thank you, Jean. Natalie, give us some of your challenges that you're meeting in your organization.
Definitely. I would say the challenges in it is for across Canada and elsewhere. The role becomes undervalued, misunderstood, or viewed as redundant. And because we're working behind the scenes and everything's confidential, some may feel there's more efficient and effective ways of handling complaints through online complaint systems or complaint service centers. And so when institutions start to make budget cuts, you often see the solitary ombuds office under attack and possibly being axed because their office isn't understood, and no one notices or protests. This has happened across Canada. In fact, in my province, 3 of 7 of our offices have been silently closed or retired when the ombuds retired. So ombuds can't be too aloof while protecting confidentiality, and must focus on being visible and accessible and demonstrating their value. The role of moral suasion is both their strength, but it's also their vulnerability, because sometimes people will say, well, get rid of that archaic appendage. They're a thorn in the administration side. And so we often advocate change that are necessary, but not always popular because they challenge the status quo. However, we're integral to the institution because we understand the culture and the complex nature of our institutions. And we know the celebrated, but we also know the guarded history that they don't want us to really know. And so we're always focused on making our institution accountable and fair, but we can't be too complacent about our security. And that's why we need to connect with other ombuds as well. I believe that ombuds are needed more than ever, especially now that we're really focused on equity, diversity, and inclusion in higher ed.
Thank you, Natalie. Zetu, what are some of the challenges you've seen?
You know what, mine do touch upon everything that colleagues said, but it goes back to the contract. It goes back to what's agreed upon in terms of your role as the ombud. Is it understood? And again, like I said, is the appointing institution ready? Because if there is no readiness or continuation with the offering is there to tick a box, almost like being compliant, and then when things come from the office that are actually in line with fairness, like Natalie said, in line with good governance, things that impact the academic project negatively, making people not want to wake up and go to a workplace, things like bullying. Once you raise those things, and depending on who the perceived bully is, then it becomes problematic, because my current circumstance, which I can speak about because I've been getting a lot of support from colleagues elsewhere, which is why these networks are useful. I would be like here and experiencing what I just experienced, and it helps to get, you know, a call from a colleague in Mississippi saying, I'm going through the same thing, Zetu, what is this? So that way, you actually know you are not insane, you are not alone, and you have a responsibility actually to keep holding that mirror, regardless of what it is showing. And the last thing, and I can only here speak for myself, you have to have integrity to do this work. And like I said, we have a history in this country of people being unseen, issues of human dignity, and also the policies in place are drawn from the Constitution. And Natalie, you know, I like that checklist that you and Nora worked upon, because other than us here in the country having the Constitution that speaks about fairness, that checklist actually aided me to actually be consistently and constantly checking what I recommend, because we might not have power to implement, but we are trusted by others to actually give recommendations that are actually helping right across. So again, it's about readiness, it's about being believable, it's about understanding that you are there to sometimes say the unsayables. And one thing we are not bringing as ombuds is a rug to hide dirt. Otherwise, rugs don't grow. Otherwise, we'll need much bigger rugs. So yeah, that's where I will end it.
Thank you, Zetu. Thank you. So, you know, it's interesting because it's true that in our role and how we conduct ourselves, it's always this delicate fine line, a bit like the seesaw that Jean was talking about, finding the right balance. And sometimes it can tip from one end or to the other. And it takes a bit of shuttle diplomacy. Amanda spoke of it. So now let's flip the coin and talk about, now we've spoken about the challenges we see in higher education, ombudsman, but what is it in terms of the value that bringing a higher education ombudsman in the organization? Amanda, would you like to start with us on that?
Sure. And I'll say just context, right? My office where I work is 4 years old. I started this office as the inaugural ombuds. It's relatively new in the grand scheme of things. And came from a groundswell, not from students, not from civil rights, but from employee associations, really saying we need a place to talk about things. We want someone to be the listener. And so this office was created from that need. And so I think that really points to the value, right? This is the only confidential space for faculty and staff to talk to anyone, right? There are formal processes that have privacy, but again, they create records, there are case notes, there's, tracking of issues. So this is the only confidential space where people can go. And as I say to them when they come to see me, right, you can be yourself. You can say it however you need to say it. It's low stakes as far as what you're telling me. Speak as freely as you're comfortable, right? And so it's a space where often the feedback I get from people is, I feel heard for the first time. I feel like someone is listening for the first time, right? And for a lot of people, that's really all they need. They want something, they'll want to process. They might come back and say, okay, now I'm ready to have that conversation with my colleague. Now I'm ready to step into that space. But the first step is to feel safe in what's happening and being able to express it and process it and feel heard and listened to. And so that trust piece, right? That's a big part of the ombuds, is being public, right? You can't hide. We have to be out. We have to present ourselves and say, hi, I'm the ombuds. Trust me, right? If you don't trust the institution. When I started, there was a lot of issues of trust of process. And I would say, if you don't trust the process, trust me, right? Here are my values here, right? I'm here to be confidential. I'm here to listen. I'm here to help navigate these problems that are coming up for you. I think that having a champion, right? Having the employee associations really champion the office has been good. I feel like I came in at a moment where there was a lot of change and readiness for change happening. But as far as the value that ombuds are providing, I think it's really just that space to articulate and be authentic in what's happening for people and be heard.
So creating a safe space is one of the added values. Zetu, would you like to bounce off on this one? Because we're also talking about in Africa, where a lot of universities are currently thinking about putting up an ombuds office. So what would be the value you'd see?
Well, for me, it starts with understanding that higher education as a sector or industry is just about one of the industries where human relationships matter. Because whether it's supervision, whether it's upward mobility, deciding who's going to mentor who and what the criteria are, so relationship is very important. That is why half of our time is in dealing with interpersonal stuff. So I almost say, and I mean, I'll be the first to declare my bias here, having seen how this office works, in the 10 years, in fact, 15 years in total that I've been ombuds, I'm thinking, well, where it doesn't exist is almost like people are being cheated, because there's this outlet that people can go to and not be judged and say it, like Amanda said, that if you don't trust the process, at least trust me, because I'm not invested. I'm here for you.
Well, obviously, and what's interesting is that if you're able to de-escalate a situation early on, it's not going to become a legal conflict for the institution, more money. And there's also this aspect where you're creating an environment within the organization where people can handle conflicts and issues. I know there's questions regarding to mediations. Natalie, time is running. So maybe I'll let you briefly talk about the humanizer aspect, I think, that you said the value.
Okay, so the ombuds provide a human face to the institution, because bureaucracies, let's face it, are cold and heartless. And so we're agents of change, and we focus on improving our institutions through moral suasion. I go back to Anderson Hill, I talk about that humanizer aspect of us, because we're the ones focused on respect, dignity, giving agency and voice to those who are marginalized. And it's true what you said, Julie, there, in terms of that human focus. that it promotes the healing and repair of relationships. It saves the bureaucracy from costly, lengthy litigation processes, protects against abuse of power, and promotes true democracy within our academic institutions. That's what Hill said.
Thank you, Natalie. I appreciate this. We're going to go step in. I think maybe Marianne or Frankie are going to let me know where we should be getting into the period of questions. We have a lot of questions for our participants. Maybe the last question, which is trendy. We're talking about social media, interaction with members. I see a lot of complaints going out there in the social media. It's viral. How are ombudsmen dealing with this in higher education? A lot of the things that happens in universities are a reflection of what happens in society. So maybe Zetu, you want to bounce off of that, and then eventually Amanda. Thank you.
Well, I'm one of the senior colleagues within the IOA at least. So when we started off, social media, there was no buzz around social media, and a lot of thinking and talking about, because as we continued to do the work, social media came in and we were talking about what are we going to do? Because, you know, if we have our views, we put ourselves out there, then we could be, you know, marginalizing certain people from coming to talk to us because they think we have positions, they misinterpret or sometimes rightly interpret what's out there in a way that makes the office not accessible. So those conversations happened. And I personally, I treaded carefully around my presence. I don't have any active presence in social media, especially around the work of the office. And I know there are ombuds who do, but as long as it's carefully maintained in a way that is not compromising the key tenets, confidentiality, dignity, respect, and all the things that we are as ombuds. What we can't control, however, is what our visitors or people who are respondents to what others came to complain about choose to say in public spaces, either about our offices, our integrity, or whoever it is that they think is worth the blame. We have no control, and it becomes left to the public to actually see where lies the truth in what I'm reading, which is unfortunate. And, you know, sometimes some people think, you know, in fact, the advice is that once in a good while, you can come out to clarify. I haven't quite heard that urge because I'm going through a situation and I've been keeping quiet saying, my time will come.
Amanda, I see you smiling. This resonates for you.
Well, that confidentiality sometimes is a hinder. It's hard when you find out that people are saying things. I know of a story of an ombuds office where someone got a call from a supervisor saying, I have an employee who's leaving every Friday 3 hours early because they say they're going to the ombuds office. I would like to confirm that they're meeting with you. It's like, I can't, what do you do, right? And so we find ways to work around that, right? Our normal practice is we meet with visitors one time, sometimes two, but very rarely on a regular basis. But I don't use social media for practice, right? I do know of ombuds offices, especially that serve students, that use social media platforms as a way to market the office, right? So they have an Instagram page where they'll promote their, you know, where they're going to table if they're at an event or a workshop that they're doing, a webinar that they're doing. But I think it's very rare. I do know we've mostly learned not to engage, right? Not to add into, to comment on things, right? That's in our sense of neutrality, it'd be very hard to engage in those things. But there's also a big social media community of ombuds, right? The IOA has its own social media platform, but there's also a large LinkedIn presence of ombuds. Ombuds are using more digital platforms, hosting lunch and learns and webinars. And I think that question, it came up in the questions in the Q&A around confidentiality, and that digital space is one of those places where we're really having to navigate confidentiality in new ways, right? I'm a solo office. I'm just an office of one, though I have an intern right now and she's delightful. Thank goodness. But I don't have someone to make an appointments for me. And knowing that if visitors get me on the phone, they're gonna just want to talk right then. And so setting up ways for people to make appointments for me is another question of confidentiality. If they're using an online system to make appointments, right? So there are all these questions of the digital world, not just within social media, but within all these other places that we have to work these days, email, calendars. So.
And I think this is a good intro into the question, because I've seen also members of the communities in higher education who are going to make the complaints right away in the social media before even coming to see the ombudsman, or they come to see us and they don't follow through what is the normal process or way of going about. So, you know, it's very quick on the button. Jean, would you like to give us some of your perspectives on that?
Yes, certainly. Somebody gave me advice very early on in the days of social media, which was don't feed the trolls. And that is advice that I took to heart. I haven't used social media in my practice, and nor would I want to. If something goes viral, and we've all seen things going viral, my advice would always be keep your head down and wait for the storm to blow over. It's not comfortable trying to ride out the storm, particularly if bad things are being said about you personally on social media, as has certainly happened. Various untruths have been out there about what's happened with the case, or what the situation is, or even, you know, being personally named and shamed on social media. But just hold your nerve, keep your head down, and do not be tempted to leap into the debate, I would say. So, and again, back to my point about mental health and support of colleagues. You know, if a colleague is getting a bashing on social media, whether it's justified or not, but supporting them and encouraging them not to get involved, just sit it out. If somebody if a complainant is trying to take something through the social media route rather than back through your process, by all means just email them, or whatever your normal contact method is, and say, I see you've posted on social media, why don't we talk about this? But very much taking it back down off the public platform and trying to liaise that way. So don't react. The storm will blow over in due course. Truly it will. Just have faith that it will. Communicate as necessary with colleagues privately, but do resist the urge to go public at any time, would be my strong advice.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jean. Zetu, did you want to pitch in? I think we're coming to the question, Q&A's question moment of this webinar. Did you want to add something, Zetu, or we're all good?
Well, I think I've spoken on this one, but
Right.
my idea is that you just don't go there, because you will, as ombuds, going to spaces you don't understand, walking Twitter streets, and that they could be dangerous if you're not used to them.
Right, and sometimes ombudsmen in higher education, if they're making a report that's public, for some reason the student union might say, we'd like to publish it in an article, there could be a misquote, or something which is stated that's not exactly. So it's always very delicate to find that balance in redressing the situation, yet not divulging. Amanda spoke about confidentiality. There's also, you know, I see there's questions. We have 10 minutes. I'm going to send it to the speakers. We're going to do the popcorn formula, the Canadian popcorn formula, which is you answer as you go. So there's many dimensions and that affect, I think, lived experience, background, social locations. And how do you as ombuds offices ensure that all clients, visitors see their office as a safe place and an office they can put their trust in? Who would like to answer that question?
I will start. What I've done, given the diversity of people that walk through the door, sorry, we have an intake form. And the intake form is, so open that we say, you tell us your name if you wish, So as soon as people get to see that there's no formality in this office, there's no interest in record, when I'm told I'm safe. So, once you've done that, I get religiously to explain the terms of reference so that that contract with the university is also the contract I enter into with my visitor. So people are allowed to ask questions, and then it's only once a person, feels like, okay, maybe I should continue with you, and then we take it from there. But they must feel safe with me first. It's one thing, Amanda, to say, trust me, but it's like, why should I? I've been disappointed before.
That's good. Anybody else who wants to pitch in on this one? Natalie, go ahead.
I ditto what Zitu is saying. It's about building trust. So it's those great skills of listening to find their social location, because we have implicit biases as ombuds as well. We have to challenge our own assumptions to get to their social location, to really understand. And the only way we can do it is around our empathetic listening skills, to really get a sense. And that's where I talk about using tools such as multi-partiality and intersectional approaches, because the ombuds can also be a person who comes from a privilege, and so has to be very careful at trying to get to understand what the individual is telling us about how they're impacted by a particular policy. We don't always understand the marginalization that they have experienced through it.
Jean, go ahead.
Yeah, I think those are very good points. But I do think at the same time, we've sometimes got to manage the expectations of the people who come to us. We cannot fix everything, and we can't necessarily always fix things in the way that they want to. So sometimes we are going to have to deliver to them some bad news or some limiting news in some way, and explain, yes, I can do this, but I cannot do that. That getting you the first-class degree is beyond my capabilities, but I can look at the problems you've had in relating to your tutor. So, managing the expectations there, I think is important.
Thank you, all of you. I see one last question. Maybe we have 30 seconds each to maybe answer. How do you measure the impact of your office? That's a question that's often asked.
And I think that we probably all take different tactics, but we do look at things we've talked about, right? Sort of that return on investment, are people leaving? What does retention rate look like? That formalized survey I talked about, are things shifting in those formal surveys, right? Can we connect those dots? I think a lot of us just look at numbers, right? How many people are we serving? How many repeated people do we serve? What kind of services are we providing? Because really, for me, and this is a personal opinion, right? It's not that the benefit of the Ombuds office is that space, right? And so are people utilizing the space? Because that is why I'm here. And so just tracking that data, it's so hard to keep the formal data, right? But just tracking that number is sort of one of those pieces. But it's a big question. Oh, we do also send visitor surveys. It's very challenging with confidentiality. And not, people don't always respond to things, but there's that. And I get thank you cards sometimes, which is really my personal, it's my favorite thing in the world.
Thank you. You want to bounce off of what Amanda's saying?
Well, I think very much similar to what she said, but the number of people coming to us means, the office is showing value, and there's buy-in, and it's being trusted. It has found its place within the establishment. So really the issue of impact has got to do with the asker and why the question. Because one person could say, if I've seen 700 people in year X, yet I've seen 500 in another year, does that mean that leadership when there was 500 was better because now there's 700, it means there's a problem with this leadership? Chances are no. So the numbers alone are also within context. So for us ombuds, I usually say if people who sell property say location is everything, our mantra is context.
That's really on point, to be wary about the qualitative aspect at an ombuds office and not just the quantitative aspect of the ombuds office role. Jean, I'll let you respond to that.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. I did actually deliver a conference session one time called, the title of which was "We Want More Complaints." And that may seem a very perverse thing to say, particularly when I was talking about resources lack of earlier on. But for me, that was a sign that my office was working well, was that complaint numbers were going up and up and up. It meant the office was visible, it was trusted, people were coming to it. So complaint numbers going up for me was a good measure. At the same time, complaints, serious complaints, big complaints being upheld was going down. So the number of complaints being resolved early was going up. And that for me was another very positive sign. It showed that departments, subunits were tackling complaints, blowing out the birthday cake candle before we've got the major conflagration.
Thank you, Jean. I'm sorry, we're missing minutes and time. We're going to have to put an end to our webinar. Natalie, you've got 10 seconds. Tu voulais dire quelque chose?
Just really about our casework is high, but also it's the preventive things that we're doing, because we're being asked by faculties and student organizations to give presentations. I gave examples like of implicit bias, repairing supervisory relationships, etc. So there are a lot of proactive pieces that we are doing as well, because we're agents of change and we're promoting social justice within our institutions. Thank you all speakers. We've covered nearly all our questions. I hope participants were able to understand and better understand what an ombudsman does in higher education, how we function. We have different corporate, or I'll say models, and how we establish our actions and our functions. I will let it off to the responsible parties of AOMA-AORC. Thank you for all being here. C'est un plaisir. Merci beaucoup.
Just the final, before we close, is the votes of thanks. I firstly want to sincerely apologize to Zetu for addressing her as advocate. She advised me this morning that she's not an advocate. My apologies there. Me. Sorry, I'm promoting you. From my mouth to God's ears. And then I want to express my sincere gratitude and appreciation to all of you who joined the webinar, organized by AORC, IOA, ACCUO, and ENOHE. Your active participation and contributions greatly enriched the discussion. They assisted us in achieving the webinar's goal of enhancing knowledge about how the Higher Education Ombudsman operates and how the Ombudsman Office can protect the rights of higher education students and staff. We want to thank our distinguished speakers, Honorable Zetu Makamandela Mgukulwa, Amanda Dean, Natalie Sharp, and Jean Greer for sharing their experiences and insights into establishing and operating a higher education ombudsman office. Your valuable contributions have been highly appreciated and will undoubtedly assist in promoting good governance, rule of law, and human rights in higher education institutions. We would also like to thank Dr. Lindiwe Makutu, Senior Lecturer, School of Law, acting on behalf of the Deputy Vice Chancellor and Head of the College of Law and Management Studies, University of KwaZulu-Natal, for welcoming us all to the webinar. Our gratitude goes out to Honorable Madeleine Nyerere, Ombudsman of Rwanda, Acting President of AOMA, for her welcome remarks, and Honorable Julie Boncompagne, Protector of Rights, Rights Protection Office, Polytechnique Montreal, for facilitating the discussion and ensuring the smooth running of the webinar. Finally, we'd like to thank all the participants who joined the webinar and raised important questions, making it a lively and interactive session. Your active engagement is deeply appreciated, and we hope the knowledge shared during this webinar will be helpful in your future endeavors. I would also like to thank Mrs. Hazel Langer. She wasn't present because of the graduation ceremonies today. She's from the University Corporate Relations Department. Her willingness to share her time and expertise was critical to the success of this webinar. We would also like to acknowledge the interpreters whose valuable service made the webinar accessible to all. And please note that the AORC team will post the questions and answers, the recordings, the links, the related documents on the website within the next week. We welcome you to visit the website and share it with your colleagues. Again, thank you all for your attendance, participation, and contribution to the webinar. We look forward to seeing you in our future webinars. Thank you and God bless.
Thank you. Goodbye, everybody.
Bye.
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 Thank you.